All right, here we go. So are we ready to roll? Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another session on the R3 Forum. As you can tell, our staff has been very busy trying to lay this event out. The final presentation we have for you today is done by John Kenny. And I'm very excited for this presentation. John has spent a lot of time working with our staff to develop this proposal and this presentation. So John is the Director of Business Development for NBC Universal's local media properties for the last 6 years. His focus is on developing new business relationships between clients and NBCU's Telemundo and NBCU-owned television stations, as well as digital media platforms. Prior to joining NBCU, John worked in the multicultural and emerging digital media and industry in Detroit, Michigan, and New York City, where he was born and raised. He is an avid outdoor enthusiast who enjoys motorcycling, snowmobiling, fly fishing, photography, marksmanship, beekeeping, and gardening. He lives with his wife, Dina, a pack of Australian Shepherds, and approximately 1.2 million honeybees in Clarkston, Michigan. John, it is with great pleasure I welcome you to the event. We're excited to learn from you. And we are looking forward to carrying on the conversation with you in the Zoom rooms this afternoon too. So thanks for your time.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here with you. Just very excited to have this opportunity, and I sincerely hope that the content module lives up. So first of all, I want to thank you guys, and then especially the council. I assure you they've been working long hours and very, very hard to make this virtual event as worthwhile and as enjoyable as possible for you. They've just been fantastic to work with, and just a joy. I'm so glad I've gotten to know them all. Thanks for the little bio, Sam. That pretty much covers everything. One thing that may damage my credibility, but Sam wanted me to mention, is that I'm also in a band. I'm actually the guitar player in a tribute to the band Poison, the hair metal band from the 80s. So I don't know if that makes me more or less credible. But anyway, what we wanted to talk about today is retention, and especially in the context of Hispanic consumers, Hispanic participants, and why this is so important. So before we get into it, I just wanted to touch on a couple of points. We're in this singular event. The COVID pandemic is really a singularity, and we can't count on there being a second singularity with a silver lining. That silver lining being, so many people embracing the outdoors and embracing the sports. So that means that we have to do everything we can to try to retain as many of the folks who have been sort of, just spontaneously thrust into this this new sort of lifestyle where they embrace being outside, embrace a conservation mentality, do things as a family outdoors, and even take it to the point of being able to be self-sufficient and provide sustenance. So the great news is, when it comes to Hispanics, retention and recruitment, or as I say, acquisition, it's really a very, very similar exercise. And at NBCU, regardless of whether we're talking about English or Spanish, we say that content drives behavior. And then from there, it's really distribution and targeting that makes that content really effective. We also recommend that when you're talking to the Hispanic consumer, and we're going to get into a lot of detail about why there's such an important constituency to go after and to try to keep outdoors, keep in the sports and outside. But we say that it's a multi-generational conversation, and we recommend that it be a multilingual conversation, meaning that it's in English and in Spanish. And as we progress through this presentation, hopefully you'll see why. And then, last but not least, we want to talk about how content is going to drive the retention, and we think that lives in validating the decision to come outdoors and embrace the sports. Also validating Hispanics' perception of themselves in the content that we deploy to retain them as participants. There's also an enormous education factor that's going to be varied by length of time in the country, whether you're born in the U.S. or an immigrant. The country of origin will have an impact because some countries that people come from may have a history of firearm or hunting or shooting as recreation and sustenance, and other places not so much. And most importantly, it's the welcome. Even if they're already outside and doing what we want them to do, we want to continuously welcome them because, as we get into the media platforms and their efficacy, I think about social media, and social media is just an electronic version of word of mouth. And I've been doing Spanish language TV and media for 21 of the 30 years I've been in the media business. And, the thing we always say is that Hispanics rely heavily on word of mouth. They might see your commercial, but there's going to be word of mouth. So Hispanics will be amongst themselves either your biggest endorser or your most detrimental detractor. So anyway, with all that said, let's jump into it. So slide, please. Our agenda today is going to be a little bit about the media landscape. I'm going to talk, of course, a little bit about NBCU. So there's going to be a few shameless plugs there, but I'm going to be even-handed, and I'm going to say a few nice things about my competitors as well. As mentioned, we're going to talk about why this consumer is so important and why we want to retain them. There's going to be some attrition as life returns to normal. So I oftentimes will say that acquisition and recruitment is the new retention too. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. The pandemic is a global phenomenon. We all obviously know that. The recovery and the reaction to it, though, is a very, very localized phenomenon. And I think when you think about the outdoor sports, the hunting, shooting, archery, just being outside in general, that is a very localized phenomenon too. You do different things in different parts of the country. So we have sort of given an example of each of the type of Hispanic markets that we see, which are emerging, growth, and established. We're going to talk about some best practices that we at NBCU believe make your content most effective. There's a little bit more shameless plugging, and then a bit of a recap and just looking out towards the future. So we're going to have a couple of questions so you don't get absolutely bored to death listening to me talk. We're going to have a little bit of an interactive thing, and there'll be polls that you'll see. And then I'm going to try to answer questions as we go if possible. I'm probably going to blow off any questions about my Poison Tribute Band until the Zoom chat. And before we do dive into this, I do have to say I'm glad this is a virtual happy hour, because if I got stuck with the time slot before an actual happy hour, I'd have to talk to my booking agent, which is unfortunately me. So anyway, let's just jump in. Next slide, please. So the media landscape. Take the next one. So this is who NBC Universal is. We are a major player in the media space. We're a subsidiary of Comcast. We're in cable. We're in broadcast. I personally work in the local media section. Very proud to say that we are comprised of 11 NBC television stations and 30 Telemundo television stations. So I think that says a lot about where NBCU and Comcast thinks the future is headed. So we're also in digital and mobile, and of course we are the makers of motion pictures, and we have a bunch of great theme parks around the world. We also have Sky over in Europe, which is a major content producer and news outlet over there. So slide, please, Sawyer. Here's a glimpse at the Hispanic broadcast and cable ecosystem. So I work for NBCU, which owns Telemundo. Very happy to be here. Prior to that, I worked at Univision, our strongest competitor. They have a sister network called Unimas. There's also Estrella TV, Azteca, Media TV, and ATV. My favorite piece of information on this slide, though, is actually the second column, where it talks about Hispanic markets. Prior to 1996, there were 6 markets in the entire United States. And when I say markets, that's media talk for cities. I won't get into the technical details of what a DMA is because it's really, really boring. But anyway, 6 markets in the entire U.S. were serviced by some form of Spanish language broadcasting entity, whether it be TV or radio. And then we flash forward to today, and there's more than 75 stations. I mentioned that we own 30 Spanish language TV stations. There are a host of cable networks now in the United States that broadcast Spanish language content. There used to be Galavisión, which is owned by Univision. And then there's also a host of international cable networks. And these are important too, because a lot of times there's just nothing that can replace a flavor of home. If you can envision yourself being, in Bolivia or Paraguay, and there was a channel that had, content that reminded you of home, even if you were completely fluent in Spanish, you'd probably watch that channel a little bit just to connect. So that's just kind of a big picture. We've got a few more slides on the media ecosystem, and then we'll jump into some other topics. So if you would, sorry, please. Looking at TV stations, as I mentioned, we own 30 Telemundo stations, only 11 NBC. Univision owns 23 stations, and most of these stations are in major Hispanic markets. 28 Unimas stations, which is their sister network. Azteca doesn't own any TV stations here in the United States because they are actually a Mexican company, and per FCC regulation, they cannot own a TV station or a broadcast entity here in the U.S. And Estrella owns 11 stations. And then looking at radio, Telemundo does not have a footprint in radio, but radio is actually very important. I know, a lot of folks aren't driving as much, and a lot of radio consumption occurs in the vehicle. But when it comes to Hispanics, a lot of Hispanics are, essential and frontline workers, so they are still out on the road. So radio, even in the pandemic, remains an effective retention tool. So just a quick glimpse here. Univision has Euphoria, which is their streaming service, 10 million listening hours, 58 radio stations. Estrella Radio has 16 stations, and Entravision, which is a company that owns affiliates, has 49 radio stations. And interestingly, they own actually more Univision programmed stations than Univision Communications Inc. does, which is often the case. There are more Telemundo affiliates than there are stations that we own. So anyway, enough media nerding, I think, about that. Moving right along. This slide is not here to bash my competition. In fact, you'll find I don't do that. I was very proud to work at Univision. We did a lot of great work there, and they continue to do so. What this slide shows you, though, is that at one point in time, Telemundo wasn't so great. That was because we were owned by GE, and they just weren't putting any resources behind it. Along comes Comcast. They buy NBC Universal, and with it, Telemundo, and they start pouring tons and tons of resources into the Hispanic enterprises side of the house. Ultimately, what happens is over the course of 5 years, we see Telemundo go to from a, also there, to a ferocious competitor. And what the final outcome here is, and the reason this slide is in this deck, is just to show you that the industry is better for it. So because of Comcast's investment in Telemundo, the Spanish language media industry is a better place and a much more effective and diversified platform through which you can retain the Hispanics who have embraced the outdoors. So just a few more shameless plugs, I promise. We consistently rank as the #1 network for Hispanics. That's combined with NBC and Telemundo. You can see Disney does quite well. Univision does great. We are the #1 digital TV company. But the thing I'm most proud of is we're actually the #6 digital property when it comes to U.S. Hispanics. And that's squaring off against Facebook and Google. So pretty impressive. But as you can see, there are a lot of great options, and that's the most important takeaway here, is that you have a ton of options to communicate to this really, really valuable consumer, and we'll get more into that momentarily. Next one slide, sorry, please. We like to talk about incremental and untapped audience, and here's just the reason this slide is here is because it sort of encapsulates what NBCU has done. We've structured our company in a way that reaches, we use both languages and content across 2 different platforms to reach this consumer in English and Spanish, and we reap the rewards in having significant additional audience, and that's just an advantage of doing business with us. So we'll move along. And then we reach, there's a lot of advertisement on national cable. This just shows that our station group does really well against national cable. So a handful of TV stations can deliver as much audience, in some cases more, than cable networks that are broadcasting to the entire country. Our competition also has very, very strong numbers in this regard. So the point really is that you have a lot of options. There's a lot of effective media out there to help you get your message out there, whether it's a message of retention, reinvigoration, further exploration, or acquisition. So I see there's a comment about acquiring new customers can cost 5 times as much as retaining additional customers. I do a lot of work in the automotive industry, and one of the things we've noticed is that, you can't attribute all vehicle purchases to the advertising, but once the media dollars are spent, they are in fact a fixed cost. And in our experience, it costs approximately $200 worth of ad dollars to acquire a Hispanic auto customer versus $500 for a non-Hispanic. So, you'll hear me say that if you build it, they will come a lot through this presentation. So feel free to chirp on the side on the chat about how annoying that is if you want to. We're going to talk now about why we want to talk to this consumer, why it's so important to retain them. But before we do that, I'm going to have a little bit of interactivity here. So we're going to throw a poll up, and there'll be a question here on the next slide, and we'd love to have you guys weigh in on what you think the answer is. And then after you've had a chance to weigh in, cover a little more content, and we'll see what you think. So first question is, which is greater, the Hispanic population of Los Angeles or the total population of Boston? And you can count Tom Brady, even though he went down to Tampa. So we're going to revisit this answer in a little bit. We'll see what you think, and we'll see what the story actually is there. So anyway, great. Move on to the next slide, please. This is my favorite ugly slide that we do. There's so much information on here, and there's even actually a bit of antiquated information that's a little dated, and the update is really kind of incredible. So there are almost 60 million Hispanics in the U.S., almost 1 in 5, 18% of the population. On the left-hand side, you'll see the non-Hispanic white population projected out over 50 years from 2010, Hispanic, African-American, Asian, and other. You can see that by the year 2060, 50 years, Hispanics will be almost 1 in 3 in terms of the U.S. population, while there's a precipitous decline in non-Hispanic whites. As you project out forward past 2060, those lines will intersect, and Hispanics will become the largest ethnic group within the United States. Very interesting. I used to work with a guy named Henry Cisneros at Univision, and he would talk about this, and he would say, I know what you're thinking. How do we stop it? Well, you can't. This is a good thing, and this is what is going to happen to the United States, and it's best to embrace it. So my favorite portion of this slide, though, is actually not quite correct. I just love the infographic, so it's there. But according to this slide, and you'll see that it's actually updated, if U.S. Hispanics, sometimes we refer to as Latinx, were construed as its own sovereign entity, it would be the 8th and now the 7th largest GDP on Earth. Actually, we've surpassed India. So U.S. Hispanics, Latinx, as we say, is actually a larger economy than a BRIC nation, which is incredible. So, when you talk about retaining a customer, this is what the future looks like. This is what the economic impact is. And we'll talk about more of that as we progress. Why do you want to retain Hispanics? Another reason, much longer lifetime value as a customer. This is, primarily a function of a younger median age. Hispanics are 15 years younger as a median age, 27 versus 42, which yields 20 additional years of buying power. Slightly longer life expectancy, but, in terms of having a customer that you want to grow within your brand or within your organization, that's why education is so important. That's why validating the decision to come outdoors and embrace the sports is so important. And that's why it is vital to keep the welcome mat rolled out. So anyway, I see a lot of people have chimed in. A lot of people have mentioned hairbands and LA, Sunset Strip. So if you thought the answer was Boston, I'm sorry, you're wrong, but most of you said LA. That is correct. LA is 8.8 million people versus 6.7 million people in Boston. 6.7 really sad million people in Boston because Tom Brady's in Tampa. So anyway, thanks for playing along. The prize you win, if you got it right, is that we're one slide closer to happy hour. Speaking of what's larger, as I said earlier, we recommend to everybody, regardless of the category we're speaking to, regardless of the industry, we want you to think about this as a multi-generational conversation. And that's because there are more people in a Hispanic household than a non. And so it is completely normal for there to be extended families living in the same domicile, all contributing in various forms to the welfare of the household and the family. A full person, actually. So you'll see grandparents, adult parents, young children, all living in the same household, many people contributing to the income It's just the Hispanics are just significantly more family focused. And what's great about this is that you can actually, you can have this conversation in 2 languages across multiple generations and have a bunch of people, engage in the sports or buy your products or utilize your services or visit your state or register for a license. It's just more a discussion of the size of the prize. So next one, please. Some key Hispanic economic indicators. This is really kind of a snapshot of Hispanics, reaching the American dream. In terms of impact on the labor force, 80% of the labor force growth from 2007 to 2017 was Hispanic. Hispanics participate in the labor force at a higher rate than any other ethnic group. As I mentioned, the updated economic data, 2.13 trillion, larger than the GDP of India. So really incredible. Hispanic household incomes are on the rise. One of my favorite slides, because I've worked in the education sector, is seeing that amongst Hispanics who are 25, there are 200,000 more who have attained a bachelor's degree. And as far as the future goes, Hispanics are the youngest ethnic demo in the United States. So really, that's why they're so vital to keep them coming outside, keep them engaged with the activities, and and bringing their friends. So next slide, please. So we wanted to talk about also the localism factor. As I said, the pandemic is global, but the recovery and the reaction is local. As we mentioned, 18% of the total U.S. population. But when you start looking at individual markets, you start to see that the story in individual markets is really much more compelling. Look at Los Angeles. Half the people in Los Angeles are Hispanic, more than half in Miami. If you go down to South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, 92% of the population down there is Hispanic. And by the way, the best tamales in the entire world are made in the Rio Grande Valley at a place called Delia's, and she'll ship them right to your door. She didn't pay me to say that. I've just had Delia's on the brain for about a month. So what's even more interesting is, regardless of where you are in the space, whether you're actually in the industries or you're adjacent, to have an impact from the Hispanic consumer by retaining the Hispanic consumer, you don't have to speak to the whole country. You can really drive a lot of impact by talking to a handful of markets. As it says here on the slide, 56% of Hispanic buying power comes from the top 10. And then astonishingly, 41 comes from the top 5. So it's really a concentrated phenomenon. And as you can see in the graphic, it's sort of mostly spread across the Smile States, but we'll talk more about markets as we proceed. Next slide, please, Sawyer. And then we just wanted to touch a little bit about where, we talked about cities, but we also wanted to talk about regions. So 39% of Hispanics live in the western part of the United States, and they are predominantly Mexican ethnic. When you look at the total U.S., I can't even see it, I'm so blind, 62% of the population is Mexican ethnic. When you look at the southern part of the United States, that most closely resembles the national composition. When you get into the Northeast, it's significantly more diverse. The reason I called out the southern portion is, like, let's say you are somebody who might be interested in growing into a national retention campaign, but you want to test out your creative, meaning your commercials or your messaging, and you want to see how it works before you go big time. You can actually use I'm going to start laughing because people are talking about poison songs and tamales now. I think I might have derailed this a little bit. Anyway, back to the southern markets. They most closely reflect the national composition, so you can do an effective test there. And that's kind of a valuable thing. Also, understanding the ethnic composition of the various regions will give you some insight into how familiar some Hispanics may or may not be with their familiarity with firearms, their rights as it relates to them, hunting in general, because depending on country of origin, as we discussed earlier, there are, there's going to be a lot of differences. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. We are at our second question here. Hopefully that'll chill some of the poison talk out. What is greater, the population of Canada or the U.S. Hispanic population? You see you've got a poll down there, and so feel free to weigh in if you like and play along at home. and we'll give you the answer in just a few. Next slide. So again, why are we talking about Hispanics? Well, we've alluded to this a little bit, but Hispanics are becoming more and more affluent. When I first started in the business 20-something years ago, I used to hear a lot, oh, John, Hispanics don't buy new vehicles. They can't afford it, and that was great because that was job security. And now job security is a very different thing because people want to talk to me. They want to learn about Hispanics. And part of that reason is because of how affluent Hispanics are becoming. This information looks at 2017 projected out 5 years. We defined in this case affluent households as 100K plus annual income, and households that are Hispanic at 100K plus are growing faster than any other segment, projected to increase by 850,000 by 2022. And then when you look at upscale, which is actually 50K plus, it's 1.5 million. And what I think is really impressive too is the rate at which these households are growing, about double that of non-Hispanics. So, this is your customer for the future. This is your enthusiast for the future. And, again, it's a silver lining to this pandemic that we've had so many people embrace the outdoors and embrace the sports. It's on us to keep them with us, and the rewards will be great. So next slide, please, Sawyer. Here we go. Here's the answer. Let's see. Looks like Tom thinks every rose has its thorn. That's great. It is, in fact, the U.S. Hispanic population. Sorry, Canada, we love you, but we've got about 20 more million Hispanics in the U.S. than Canada has on its soil. Next one, please. So, speaking of younger, larger, these folks grew up in the internet age. I know I did a lot of shameless plugging of NBCU, and, I grew up as a television guy, but Hispanics in the U.S. have grown up in the internet age. And I'm going to indulge in a little story here that promotes my competition. They don't pay me to sell my competition, but I feel strongly about sharing this little anecdote with you. So when I was at Univision, Jerry Parencio, who's a fascinating guy, you should look him up. He's no longer with us, but an amazing man who lived an incredible life. He brought Univision from a couple of TV stations to this media powerhouse. And he recognized a lot of things, he saw trends happening and could almost see the future. And he knew the internet was going to be huge. He also knew that Hispanics were going to experience a digital divide. They weren't going to have access the way non-Hispanics were, because we're talking back in the early 2000s. So he started Univision Online, which is very similar to AOL, if anybody on this virtual chat is able to remember back to AOL days. So it was a subscription service. And what Jerry did was, if you signed up for Univision Online, he provided your home with an internet-connected computer at no charge. Admittedly, they were refurbished, but nonetheless. And I think that single-handedly contributed to having Hispanics not only embrace the internet, but in fact leapfrog and go directly to mobile. So, there's a lot of information on the screen. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but 60% of U.S. Hispanics were born in the internet age, whereas 40% of non-Hispanics were. So really, when you're talking about retaining these folks, communicating to them in any way, shape, or form, if you're not here, you're not anywhere. So with that said, we can move on to the next. Quick look at social media. To me, this is the electronic word of mouth. I'm not a fan of Facebook. I think I'm on Facebook, but I don't actually participate. I have an account, I think is the accurate way to describe that. But they are a staggering entity. You cannot ignore Facebook's power in terms of reaching an audience, and they've got some pretty interesting targeting capabilities there as well. You can see here that Hispanics utilize the platform pretty extensively. It talks about unique visitors. What that means is, like, in a month, if you go to facebook.com or log into Facebook once or 1,000 times, you're counted once. And as you can see, almost 32 million people do that each month here in the U.S. They reach 84% of Hispanics, and almost 15% of Facebook users in the United States are Hispanic. Insta is Insta does great. And if you go down to the bottom, TikTok, in terms of the number of their users, that's actually the highest platform. And then we've got on the right-hand side of this, it discusses some of this data by ethnicity. And as you can see, Hispanics do utilize social media quite well, with Facebook being the leading platform in terms of just raw numbers. Thanks, Lauren. Relevant advertising sources. So as I said, it's the word of mouth. So social networks are really important. This slide looks at it from the perspective of acculturation, and by acculturation, we mean a number of things, not the least of which is use of language, but it's also, other cultural aspects. So unacculturated are folks who are predominantly reliant on Spanish and have not really embraced a more Americanized version of themselves. Bicultural, or the 200%ers, as we like to call them, are fully engaged in their Latin heritage, but fully engaged in their American heritage as well. And then more acculturated, who've sort of put their Latin culture a bit to the back. Not, nobody's abandoning it totally, but a little bit to the back, and really kind of embraced a more Americanized persona. So this sort of spells that out among, what I think is great, though, is among all Hispanics, social media networks are very important as a relevant communication point, but so is television and radio. One of the things that happened with Hispanics is they sort of just leapfrogged past print. The print industry never really evolved that much, and by the time Spanish language media was really coming to the forefront, the internet had supplanted print, in a lot of ways anyway. So that's kind of what's going on there. If we can move on to the next, wanted to talk a little bit about the pandemic and how that's having an impact on, how people are consuming media. So media consumption in the U.S. was pretty much rocking at historic highs before the pandemic, according to Nielsen, and now it's actually, increased considerably. A lot of us are working from home and have media on in the background, so that's part of the equation. Mobile usage has crept up, TV has crept up. We also see radio, again, surprisingly, radio's increased despite the fact that people are spending less time in their cars. So, it's just an interesting phenomenon. Of course, print is continuing to see a decline, and I think that's also a function of the immediacy of information that people are seeking. So, it's really the ball game is really in the form of mobile and video and audio content. So, next slide, please. How Hispanics have been impacted. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Hispanics are frontline workers, essential workers. And this is going to vary by market, but we see Hispanics, still out in the workforce, still doing, a lot of the jobs that have to be done. So because of this, they're away from TV sets and are more reliant on mobile. So as I said earlier, if you're not on a handheld device, you're basically not in front of a Hispanic. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate TV. It's my bread and butter, but you have to, my job here is to try to help you folks understand as much as possible the best way to reach, this consumer. So Hispanics are spending 2 hours more a week consuming content on their mobile devices during the pandemic, and Hispanics spend about 30 hours a week on their smartphones, more than any other device. Really pretty extraordinary. And that's largely a function of having to have some way to stay connected while not at home. So next slide, please. This one makes me happy because I am a TV guy at heart. I do represent a lot of different properties within the NBCU portfolio, but I grew up in broadcast television, and it is still nearest and dearest to my heart. So this is a phenomenon a long time in the making. I talked about Univision doing that great thing as far as the digital divide is concerned and helping Hispanics have access to the internet. Well, Spanish language media companies have been doing a lot of work in terms of connecting to our audience in a more meaningful way for a long time, and really having the ability to establish ourselves as a trusted source. Just one more anecdote from back in the Univision days. I was good friends with a guy who ran our San Francisco station, and he told me this amazing story. A family had just recently moved to the U.S. and just happened to win the California State Lottery shortly after they arrived. It wasn't, like a Mega Millions, but it was like $7 or $8 million, life-changing money. They were completely freaked out, as anybody would be. But rather than contact the California Lottery or even the police, they actually contacted KDTV Channel 14, the Univision station in San Francisco, and said, "Hey, we think we just won the lottery. We have no idea what to do. Can you please help us?" So that's a function of, the content that we put out as Spanish language media outlets being focused on our audience, in service of our audience. And because of that, we've built this incredible relationship. So when you're looking to keep in communication with this spontaneous surge of Hispanic participants that the pandemic has brought to us, local television is considered, the number one source of information for coronavirus. Broadcast TV, number two, and then Insta, which is pretty amazing. Public television and Twitter, other internet news outlets as well. 42% lift in television viewership, and as we mentioned earlier, quite a bit of time spent on the handheld with 30 plus hours per week on a smartphone, more so than any other device. Next slide, please. So this is going to be the last question for the interactive portion. So again, we've got our poll up. So if you would like to participate, the question is, what is greater, the GDP of Latinx, how we refer to U.S. Hispanics, or the GDP of Spain or Colombia? And we'll give you the answer shortly. Feel free to weigh in. So speaking of GDP and finance, again, I know I'm sort of pounding on the economics of this, and that might be, a function of how I grew up in the Spanish language media business, where people questioned, whether or not Hispanics had credit or had good credit or were financially literate or even, financially capable of making major purchases, and I've seen this story change over the 2+ decades that I've been in the business. And the thing I'm most proud of, and we'll see more of it as we move forward, is actually home ownership. But, Hispanics have had a major impact on the financial category across a number of different sub verticals, including credit card use. I think probably the foundational financial organizations that really first touched on having Hispanics be part of their consumer base was the auto finance companies that were sort of captive arms of the automotive industry. The automotive industry has, I think, been one of the early adapters, reaching out to Hispanic consumers in language, and continue to market to Hispanics to this day in language, because one of our fellow participants mentioned earlier, it's difficult and expensive to acquire new customers. Once you got them, you don't want to lose them. I think I've never seen a study, but I've got to imagine if you have somebody, then you lose them, that's even more difficult to get them back than just acquiring a new customer, and certainly more so than retaining one in the first place. But the captive finance houses of automotive manufacturers have long understood that Hispanic consumers will do what it takes to get into a vehicle. And, even with the current political climate, Hispanics are still a very powerful driving force within the automotive industry, in many cases providing the only growth source through a lot of 2019. But as I mentioned, Hispanics own, I didn't mention this actually, Hispanics own 14% of all non-agricultural U.S. businesses. That's probably pretty eye-opening for a lot of folks. And we're going to touch on the incredible home ownership story. In fact, Hispanics are the only group that has maintained growth consecutively over the last 3 years in terms of the rate of home ownership. So if we could jump to the next slide. This is my favorite slide, I think, in the deck. I remember getting my first house. I don't think anything represents the American dream more than, turning the key for the first time and walking through your own door into your own home, whether it's a tiny little bungalow or a ranch or whatever the case may be. To me, this is the crystallization of the American dream, and I think it's very true for Hispanics. I work with Rocket Mortgage, who's here in the Metro Detroit area. I'm sorry, I probably should be, it looks like we've got some questions here. Let's see if I go here, do I get them? Okay. I'm going to take a minute here and just look at these questions, because I did say I'd try to take questions as we go. Somebody asked, great slides, would love to use those with my customers. Can we have copies? Kara, yes, you can. We'll figure out how to get them to you. Somebody wants this in a shareable document, most definitely. Jim, you got a question. I'll leave that one for you. And then I guess the other questions are we're going to provide this content to you later. And then somebody had a question about podcast usage. And as far as Hispanics go, that's a great great question. I don't have any information. I know that we are just getting into the podcast space. Spotify just signed Joe Rogan, who I think has the most listened to podcast. They're an interesting space. There's a couple of giants in the podcast space in English language. There are certainly a handful of folks in the Spanish language space who I think could be huge podcasters. But in my experience, Hispanics typically consume media in close to real time. So I think, we may see a bit of a lag in terms of podcasts. I don't think it's going to be as an effective medium, and it won't see the kind of growth that other emerging media have seen, like social and so forth. But great question. And, I'll follow up tomorrow when I talk to my research folks. I do know that, we're getting more involved with our sports podcasts. We're promoting them more. I think another place you should think about is gaming. That's just a young person's space. And, gaming consoles can function as over-the-top devices, meaning that much like a cable box, set-top box, or a satellite dish, you can receive audio-video content streaming through PlayStations, Xboxes, and that sort of device. And especially when it comes to young males, we see a lot of people migrating to those platforms. So as you're thinking about how to retain folks, don't overlook gaming as well as podcasts, because while there aren't an enormous number of Spanish language podcasts, as I've been talking about all along, Hispanics consume content in both languages. So we're moving along pretty good here. So I just want to touch on this slide again, if I may. So Hispanics are really just doing an amazing job at embracing home ownership in the United States. And as I mentioned, here in Detroit, I work with Rocket Mortgage. And I've got a very dear friend who works there, and he's in charge of their multicultural advertising. And they just started 2 years ago, but they dispensed with the crawl walk phase and just went straight to run. And I can tell you they are spending millions of dollars in terms of marketing. And, they're not just marketing in Spanish. They're really trying to be culturally relevant, meaning that there is, of course, Spanish language advertising, but they're also reaching Hispanics with English language content that features Hispanic-looking people doing things like Hispanics would do, perhaps at a quinceañera party. That's a celebration, coming-of-age celebration for young Latinas. They engage in cultural events, and one of the things I think is most impressive is that they have invested in enormous resources in ensuring that they have call centers that are staffed by bilingual home loan experts. So they have the ability to take calls in English and Spanish 24/7. So they are all in on this consumer, and these numbers sort of speak to that. I just think it's amazing. We've seen almost 800,000 additional Hispanic-owned homes, 7.5 million, 59% of the total home ownership growth in the United States. And that's ownership, not the establishment of households, but actual ownership is coming from Hispanics. So this to me is, something I just think it's something I've watched happen over the last 20 years. And not that I've had much to do with it, but I'm proud of it anyway. So anyway, next slide, please, Sawyer. Hispanics affect a lot of categories. I primarily function in the automotive space. Thanks to people like Sam and the council, I'm able to branch out a little bit. Thanks to the folks at Rocket Mortgage, I can do something besides the Groundhog Day that is automotive marketing. But when you look at CPG, and this takes a peek at the top 10 Hispanic markets, which are different from the top 10 markets because we rank them by Hispanic population. LA being the top, New York, Miami, Chicago, Houston, San Francisco, Phoenix, and so on. But 52% of the total Hispanic grocery spend comes from the top 10 markets. The reason we call this out is, again, just to showcase to you that, when you want to reach out to these people and say, hey, we're glad you're here. We want you to stay with us. We want you to grow with us. We want you to learn. We want you to bring your friends, your family outdoors, learn how to provide for yourselves, learn how to bring food to the table, learn how to care for nature and the earth, and have a mind that is focused on being a conservationist This can be done at scale nationally or down to the zip code level or anywhere in between. But this calls out that just the top 10 Hispanic markets represent more than half of the Hispanic grocery spend. I see some of the comments, larger families equals more groceries. That's right. And there's a lot more kids per household. So there's going to be more dairy, more diapers. So you're right on, Darcy. And then just looking at Hispanics who are women 25-54 in these top 10 markets, they're 35% of the population, but they account for 39% of the spend in terms of groceries. So really a pretty amazing story. And, I could cite chapter and verse across automotive, finance, all sorts of categories where Hispanics are really an incredible driving force. So if we could hit to the next slide. So here's the answer to the last question. I didn't see a whole lot of responses, of maybe one or two, but the answer is that the Latinx GDP is actually greater than both Spain and Colombia combined at 2.3 trillion versus 1.7 for the two nations combined. So that's the last of our interactive. We did want to talk a little bit about COVID and how it's impacted home and leisure. I mean, that's really why we're here talking about retention, right? This incredibly destructive force has somehow managed to have the silver lining of having individuals, and in the case of Hispanics, going outdoors and embracing out-of-home activity, including, hunting, shooting, and, being just outdoors people in general, boating, fishing, etc. 87% of total consumers are now spending time outdoors. Who would have thought that a terrible virus could have a silver lining? Of those, almost 12 million adults 18 plus are Hispanics. And we've learned that Hispanics are slightly more likely to go outside and do some exercise. What the big picture is consumers have gained a new appreciation for the outdoors. And they understand that sustainability is a big deal. When we talk about content, we're going to talk about education. This is part of it. I think, Hispanics are eager to learn. I don't think we've done anything in the space to really embrace them outside of a handful of organizations, but when you look at retail and you look at a lot of marketing, we don't see Hispanics in the content. We don't see them being reached out to as much. And we certainly don't see a concerted effort to educate. And I think, I'd like to implore everybody who's listening to this session, watching the session, to make sure that as you discuss developing content, and we can certainly help you with that, as can our competition, make sure that there's an educational component. So next slide, please. In terms of plans to travel, this isn't necessarily about Hispanics. It looks at young folks and then people like me, Gen X. So 70% of consumers who have postponed travel are thinking about getting back into travel in the next year. So in terms of retention, this is a great opportunity for state and local government organizations who might be fish and wildlife departments who want to encourage people to come visit their states to enjoy the fishing and the hunting that's available there. Now's the time to start planning that, because people are getting ready to return to some form of whatever the new normal is. We at NBC are seeing a return to live sports. We've got the NHL playoffs going on. It's weird to see hockey happen without fans in the stands, but it's still great to see hockey on television. The NBA is live. Baseball is live. So we're going to see some sort of return to the new normal, and that's going to result in some attrition. I mean, there's no way around it. The question is, how much of it do we allow to happen by taking no action? And how much of it can we prevent by taking really, really smart action, by going after a consumer group who has been underserved in terms of communication, marketing, and retention efforts, as well as underserved in terms of recruitment and acquisition. So I see a couple of comments here. Culturally, Hispanics eat out less and have family dinner more than non-Hispanics too. I don't know. Actually, I don't think the kitchen is the heart of the home, without a doubt. I think that's true across most cultures. But Hispanics do like to dine out, and they actually really, really love pizza. Hispanics over-index dramatically when it comes to pizza. And a strange little factoid about Detroit is we're also, I think, the pizza capital of America, not just the domestic auto capital. We've got Little Caesars, Domino's, Hungry Howie's, and Jets, to name a few, those who are out in the Midwest. But, Yeah, the kitchen, the cucina is the heart of the household. And, family meals are important, but it could be that it's takeout and it could be that we're going out to eat. But to your point, JD, it is a family thing, and that just underscores the point that I made at the outset, that you want to have this conversation with the whole family. It's multi-generational, and multilingual. So this Jets is the best. I'm from New York. No, it isn't. So, just looking at the slide, it looks like people are within, most of the age brackets we're looking at here are falling within that plan to start traveling again within the next year or so. So, Sawyer, if you could give us the next slide, please. In terms of Hispanics, they have a propensity to travel domestically. Of adults 18 plus in the U.S., 26 million Hispanics have taken a domestic trip in the last 12 months, 55% of adults 18 plus who are Hispanic. And of those, 13 million have done so for vacation-related travel. And 11.5 million Hispanics have taken a domestic trip in the last 12 months. So basically half of them come from the top 10 markets. So you'll see that I keep repeating that theme about the top 10 or the top 5 markets. It's just really to underscore that it is a localized phenomenon, the Hispanic phenomenon in the U.S. It's happening across the country, but each individual market is its own sort of microcosm where, sometimes I think it's almost like a time machine where you can see into the future. You look at, I remember when LA was 37% Hispanic when I first started in this business, 36%, and thinking about, wow, when's it going to catch up with Miami? Things like that. And so when you look at these individual markets, you're seeing the future of the whole country. And, I know I'm a broken record, but that's why it's so important to retain. And Melissa, I want to take back my comment about Jets. I really do love the deep dish with ham on it. It's quite delicious. So anyway, sorry, if we could jump to the next one. So here is, I think, the last absolutely shameless plug for us. So NBCU is actually the home of sports, in my opinion. Just to take a look at what's going on now. As I said, we've got the NHL. We've got the U.S. Open golf. We've got the Kentucky Derby, the Triple Crown. The NFL will be on our air soon. We have an event that was supposed to take place in Tokyo this current summer, but we postponed that till next year. The Olympics, which features archery. So those of you who are in the archery space, you might want to think about talking to us about getting involved in the Olympics. We do have relationships with the governing bodies of most U.S. National teams, men, women, and otherwise. So in looking at our sports viewers, whether they're Hispanic or not, they're inclined to engage in the activities that we are here to promote and here to ask them to stay. So, the great news is, as I said earlier, the exercise to attract and acquire is very similar to the exercise to retain. And the best news of all is that the soil is fertile. These people are already into it, at least on our air. And I don't have any information for this presentation about our competition, but I theorize often that people's remote controls work pretty well. And I don't think, there's a lot of Hispanics who are just absolutely like, never watching Univision. They're terrible. There's plenty of cross-pollination, plenty of cross-pollination in English as well as Spanish. So I think if this is true about the people who watch sports on my air, then it's probably true about the people who are watching sports on CBS, Hispanics who are watching sports on Univision or Azteca or anywhere. So just a great story, though. So I think when you talk about, how important this consumer is, like I said, it's fertile soil. They're already over-indexing dramatically. And I think, when you don't have unlimited resources, you have to be strategic. And sports might be, the sort of content in which to place your content. So anyway, if we could take the next slide, please, Sawyer. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to talk a little bit about how we look at markets. We sort of put them in 3 different buckets. Established markets, growth markets, and then emerging markets. And I've only got 3 examples here. I had a lot more, but I also had a lot of video in this presentation. But because the good people at the council are so nice, and having 500 megabytes worth of video was getting a little wonky as far as the tech is concerned, and I didn't want them to become stressed out any more than they already were trying to make this a great experience for you, I decided to delete all the videos. And I am going to reference one of those videos, at least as part of the voiceover. Here's an example of an established market in Hispanic America, Los Angeles. It's become a recurring theme throughout the presentation. Almost 9 million Hispanics, basically half the population of LA is Hispanic, relatively stable growth rate, and then, pretty impressive household income, very strong growth in terms of household income since 2013, and a really extraordinary, consumer spend in terms of discretionary income. We also want to have you guys be able to understand the ethnic composition of the marketplace. And of course, like much of the Western United States, as we mentioned earlier, Los Angeles is going to be largely Mexican ethnic, proximity to Mexico being, one of the primary drivers. When you look at the west coast of the United States, the I-5 corridor is essentially, from Tijuana up to the San Juan Islands and everything in between. And Hispanics follow that route. Some are agricultural workers who go up into, the Pacific Northwest and certainly work the Central Valley, and others are in other industries. But, the I-5 corridor has certainly been a conduit for Mexican ethnic Hispanics for generations. So that's one example. Others are Miami, New York, Chicago. There's basically multiple established markets in every region of the country where, you go to the airport, the announcements are in English and Spanish. Every sign you see is in English and Spanish, that sort of thing. So that's an example of established. The next bucket is growth. So these are markets that are not quite as huge as, say, a Los Angeles or a Miami, but are substantial, but still very much in growth phase. So like a Phoenix is a growth market because a lot of people are leaving California for a more affordable cost of living. Denver is another one. I think Denver is just on fire in general, but it has a particularly robust Hispanic community there. Over 1 million Hispanics, 22% of the total population. Again, a growth rate of 11%. Strong household income and incredible disposable income, much like the rest of the Western United States, predominantly a Mexican ethnic, but with a significant, distribution of other ethnicities throughout. I oftentimes will call out in the West, Salt Lake City as an interesting market. Even though it's a Western market, it certainly is predominantly Mexican ethnic. It, among Western markets, has the most diverse Hispanic population, largely due to the work of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and all their mission work. So they, of course, go throughout the world, Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, and, they do their work. And a lot of times, they'll make converts, and then people migrate to Salt Lake City and Utah because it's a very robust economy and the quality of life is great. So I just call it out because it's I'm a nerd about TV and I'm a nerd about Spanish language media, and I'm pretty much a nerd about Hispanics. And I just think that's kind of interesting. Salt Lake City would actually fall in the next bucket. So if you would, Sawyer. These are the emerging markets. So, we picked Raleigh as an example. And like I said, I can provide this analysis for every market in the country. Anything you want, we can certainly share with you. So there's 375,000 Hispanics in Raleigh, 11% of the total population. But the growth rate, when you look at the previous two examples, was in the low teens. Raleigh's up to almost 20% since 2013. Great household income, up 16%. And, not the $200 billion that LA is projected to spend by 2023. But, what's great about these markets, what's great about all of them is that, you've got a different approach in each one. But the beauty of a market like Raleigh is the cost of entry in terms of communicating to Hispanics. While there's not a proliferation of media outlets, there's definitely something there. There's definitely going to be a Univision affiliate. There's definitely going to be a Telemundo affiliate. There's definitely going to be the ability to geo-target via Facebook or other online entities. And the cost of entry there is going to be really, really low. So again, if you're just thinking about sticking your toe in the water, or you're concerned that you're going to lose this influx of consumers that have cleaned your shelves off, fishing poles and bows and arrows, then you can actually get your message out there at very, very low cost in a market like Raleigh and a lot of these emerging markets. Quite frankly, Spanish language media just doesn't cost as much as English language media, because the theory is that you're not trying to reach the whole market, even though we are. Like if you look at Los Angeles or Miami or New York, or basically any of the top markets in the United States, a Spanish language TV station is probably going to be the number one station, whether it's Univision or us. For example, in Miami, we are by far and away the number one television station. Nobody even comes close, not even our NBC station, which I'm embarrassed to say, but it's true. In Los Angeles, Univision is typically a very, very close number one or number two with us, leaving KNBC or KABC, literally in the dust, because there's fewer outlets that people are going to get the content that they choose. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. I'm going to take a quick peek at the chat here for a sec. U.S. Hispanic participation in the outdoors closely resembles white participation. Is this a considerable shift versus a decade ago? Yeah, Darcy, I think very much so. But it's not just a phenomenon in the outdoors. I think it's every facet of life. The current political climate is I think a little bit frightening to a lot of Latinos. I'm not going to get into the whys or the what fors. It's just a fact. But prior to that, I think it was the first time really in my lifetime outside of living in New York where I grew up, everybody was Hispanic. I didn't realize, that there were a lot of different ethnicities. I grew up in a neighborhood that was 80% Hispanic. My best friends were Anastasio Peña, Eddie Diaz, Maximo Centano, Andrea Carraro, Alyssa Argentina, so for me, it was strange, but I think recently it has become very cool to be Latin. There was a Latin explosion, where even Latin culture was permeating not just itself and the Hispanics, but it was actually spreading out beyond the Hispanic population here in the U.S. So, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it actually is a trend that will continue. And I think it's pervasive across basically every aspect of life. Let me look and see what Don has to say. U.S. population goes up. Choose white population. What are the drivers behind those trends? Great question. So, it's interesting that you're welcome, Darcy. A lot of people think immigration is driving the Hispanic population, but it's actually U.S. births. So Hispanics are younger by 15 years in terms of a median age, Don. And so are therefore actually, in that sort of prime of life where they're establishing families in prime reproductive years, and just typically come from a more family-based disposition from a cultural, psychological, emotional perspective. And, my wife and I, we never opted to have children. We thought about it and we decided we didn't want to. And I think that's just a thing that's happening. Whereas with Hispanics, it's just not. So we're seeing U.S. Hispanic births really driving the population. And I think it's the aging of the non-Hispanic population, particularly the non-Hispanic white population, that is in fact driving the birth rate down. And I think it's also I think it's a lifestyle choice for a lot of people nowadays. My wife and I oftentimes will joke around and tease our friends with kids. Like, before the pandemic, like, what are you doing? Oh, we're doing this. We're taking the kids to baseball. What are you doing? We always would say something obnoxious, like exactly what we feel like whenever we feel like it, and that really makes me kind of a jerk for saying that, but we joked around about it. And I think it really kind of just is a lifestyle choice. Jim, let me see what you've got here. Can you touch on different marketing messages to acculturated versus bicultural and unacculturated Hispanics? Has somebody slipped Jim an advanced copy of this presentation? I think that's the case. Yeah, for sure. We're going to get to that. So thanks, Sam. Sam says no. Great question. We are going to get to that. Content, as I said at the beginning, drives behavior, and distribution and targeting is what makes the content work for you. So I think we'll just jump right to that. Let me see what's next. Sawyer, please. Best practices in content creation. See, I don't believe you, Sam. I think he's got a copy. Next slide. So anyway, these are the pillars we think are impactful and make for a successful communication. Meaningful intellectual property, scale, being able to communicate at scale across the nation if you want, or down to the zip code, multi-channel distribution, which, I think I spent a decent amount of time talking about platforms where NBCU doesn't play in an attempt to be even-handed, even though I am as shameless salesperson at a mitochondrial level. And then content partnerships. So we talk about content partnerships in a couple of different ways. I'm going to go from actually right to left. So we can, as well as many of our competitors, can help you develop content, meaning your ads, if you're in the business of advertising, or we can actually help you develop other content. Sometimes we refer to that content as native, which is essentially content that looks like it's not an advertisement, but is. And that sounds wonky and a bit deceptive. It's called out. This is an advertisement. Or this content was developed in partnership with our friends at at Mitsubishi, for example. So we can help you create an ad, or we can help you have content that tells a story, that educates, that reinforces your brand without being a direct sales pitch. Our competitors can do the same. Multi-channel distribution. This, I think, Jim, is part of the equation too. Different levels of acculturation are going to have different media usage patterns. So when you are hitting Hispanics on all the platforms they touch, you're kind of getting your message out there. And again, you want the message in English and in Spanish. So as I said earlier, scale is vital. We at NBCU can deliver zip code level scale or national scale or everything in between. Our competition is, I think, pretty capable in that regard as well. I think, as far as the industry is concerned, we're at a point now where that's table stakes. If you can't target somebody in a zip code, have a one-to-one conversation via your platform, or reach millions of people with one swing, you're not really at industry standards, and you're going to have an unpleasant date with Mr. Darwin. And then meaningful IP. That's being involved in content that resonates. That means that you're going to want to seek out a partner, whether you're talking about acculturated Hispanics. You might want to seek out English language content that features Hispanics prominently, doing Latin cultured things in that content. Where Hispanics will see themselves, see people who look like them, see people who are doing things that they do, hear sounds that sound like their homes or their outings. It's a validation question. But meaningful IP, content that is high quality, high profile, that connects with people. And this is the golden age of television. This is the golden age of content. John, I see you said we didn't share. I'm only teasing. So we don't have the market cornered on great content. There's so much out there. I think that's the cornerstone, having your message live in content that is compelling to people, content that makes people seek it out. Because, one of the things I neglected to mention at the outset is that, content drives behavior, but behavior can drive content too. For us as content creators at NBCU and for all of our competition, we have had to adapt. There was a time where, there was a great deal of resistance to putting our content anywhere except in primetime television at a certain time on a certain day. And if you didn't get it, too bad. Then VCRs came along, and then DVRs came along, and now we're in the age of streaming. So we have relaxed our posture of kind of ignoring our audience foolishly and have embraced the fact that people are choosing content in whatever language they want. They're choosing it on whatever device they want. They're choosing it wherever they want, and they're choosing it whenever they want. So, back to your question, it's embracing that. It's embracing choice, right? So if you want to reach acculturated Hispanics, you're going to have to understand them. They're choosing to hold on to their Latin culture, but they're also choosing to be more American forward than Latin forward. And so that might have repercussions as to what kind of language you use in any content that you put forth. You might, as I said, use Hispanic-looking folks who are speaking in English. There might even be an older person in the ad. I think Zillow did a fantastic job with an ad that was out probably second half of last year. It was all in English. It featured a Hispanic family, and they're all celebrating the son, who's a young adult, maybe late 20s, who's making his first home. He's purchased his first home and showing it to the family. And the mother, there's only one Spanish word in the whole spot, and she just says mijo, which means my son, in a very loving and familiar way. And it's very, the word is delivered with, the depth of emotion that a mother would feel seeing her son, show her his first home, especially being Hispanic and home ownership being that incredibly important milestone and, truly the most representative thing of achieving the American dream, the thing she dreamt about when she was a kid, seeing come to reality for her son. And that was all captured in one word on English language television, in mostly English, but with one Spanish word. So there's a way you can reach out to, all three buckets of Hispanics, acculturated, bicultural, and less acculturated, because they're going to see, they're going to get what's going on. And so we'll talk more about it though. So Sawyer, if you would kindly move along to the next one. In language and in culture. So we have 30 Spanish language television stations. So I want to tell you Spanish language is important. It is. Is it the only thing? Is it the be all? Is it the end all? It absolutely is not. I would be lying if I said that. There was a time where, it was probably more important. But now I think the case is more compelling because it's a matter of choice. Like I said, when we were talking about the previous slide, it's so important to embrace the choice of a consumer, right? You have to respect it. You have to talk to people. You have to interact with people. If you're trying to get them to be involved with you, if you're asking them to join you either as a customer or a participant in your organization's activities, or an endorser, or somebody who just simply is a positive, word of mouth purveyor, you're going to have to do it on their terms, and that means talking to them in the language they want, which can be multiple. It could be, I have a lot of friends who will start a sentence in English and finish it in Spanish. And luckily I can understand a lot of Spanish. I can't speak it to save my life, but I can understand it, and I'll oftentimes speak to people when I'm dealing with someone who is, Hispanic and I don't really know them, but they're in a marketing position. I try to ask them what they think about using Spanish language. I'll ask them what language do they dream in, and that's oftentimes a big indicator because that's your unconscious mind. And they say oftentimes they dream in both languages. But anyway, what's most important to any Hispanic, I think, is not so much the language, although it is vital. And it is oftentimes cited as one of the most, important and impactful things that define someone as Latin or Hispanic. But it is the respect, the acknowledgement, and the contextual relevance of culture. You have to understand that first and foremost. Culture is the most important thing. And so if you're acknowledging culture, you're going to win in this space. There are different ways to do it. You can be in language, you can be out of language. As long as you are acknowledging and respecting culture, you're going to have a lot of success here. There's a lot of information on this slide. I don't want to go through it. I'm not going to be a slide reader, but just know that, in language is important, and we'll show you something in the next slide or two about that. But in culture is most important of all. And as you can see, Jim, we use language as the primary sort of indicator of acculturation. Spanish dominant being less, English dominant being most, and bicultural being, kind of the sweet spot, the 200%ers, as we say. But you can see that acknowledging culture is the most important factor for most of these folks, more so even than language. So, sorry, if I can have the next slide, please. And we're going to wrap this up soon, I promise, folks. We've got two versions of this, and I'm going to blaze through it real quick. This is the top 10 Hispanic markets, adults 25-54. This looks at news and prime. It looks at the whole marketplace. The black portion of the pie chart is people who are Spanish dominant. Forgive me, who are not Spanish dominant, and the 19% in this instance are Spanish dominant. So that's the entire adult 25-54 population of the top 10 Hispanic markets. Now we look at television viewership in the same group. Late news, 62%. 62% of the viewership goes to English language television. 38% goes to Spanish. 19% of the Hispanics, 19% of the population is Spanish language dependent, yet 38% of the population consumes Spanish language content. What does this mean? For some, it's a necessity. Some, it's a dependence on the language. But for an enormous number of people, it is a choice. That's late news for information, prime time for entertainment. So people are choosing to be entertained and informed in Spanish. Well, 25-54, they're old. I don't really care. I need to talk to younger people. That's probably less true when you're talking about adults 18 to 49. Well, let's have a look. Nope. Counterintuitively, it's actually more true among younger people. And I think this reflects back to, what I was talking about earlier, where it is in fact cool to be Hispanic, maybe for the first time, in my lifetime, where it's socially it's considered a plus. Being bilingual is an asset, and I think, it's just a wonderful time to be Hispanic, and the fact that we are embracing this culture and just, I think it's a function of younger people. They just seem to be kinder than the generation I grew up in. But what I love about this same story, 20% of the population is dependent on the language, more than double that consume the content. So really just an amazing story there. And I think that should tell you, again, just really underscore the point about choice. If you're trying to ask these people to stay with you, then you better respect their choices and you better hit them where they are. That's on the mobile and it's in both languages. So if we can move along, Sawyer, and try to kind of close this out so we can get to happy hour. This just underscores the same point. What I think is really most fascinating is if you look on the far right-hand side with young Hispanics, 21 to 34 years old, the ideal consumer. When you look at a much more loyal, and Spanish language advertising is important because it conveys information effectively. Among younger Hispanics who are bilingual, who are truly, I think, the sweet spot of all of the acculturated, unacculturated, or bicultural, that's the sweet spot. And among those folks, the young ones, that is most true. That folks who talk in Spanish are acknowledging culture, and that really just underscores, as I said, language being one of the most significant cultural identifiers. So, if we can move to the next one, please. And then, I talked earlier about Hispanics driving growth in a lot of categories. This is another great ugly slide. Hispanics in 2019 actually represented the only actual growth in the automotive industry. They were up 3% while non-Hispanic was down. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see basically a who's who of who advertises in Spanish. So a case of if you build it, they will come. If you welcome them, they'll come to you. They'll say, hey, I saw that you invited me. Funny anecdote real quick. I can tell you a million stories, but one thing we see in the automotive industry is that when you talk about local dealerships, what we call tier 3, John Kenny's Friendly Chevrolet in Clarkston, Michigan. If I don't advertise in Spanish, even though I've got the best deal, Hispanics will drive 20 miles past me because somebody did, in fact, advertise in Spanish and say, hey, I'd like you to come see my store. We'd love you to come buy a Chevy from us. I've got a nice big cubicle. We can accommodate your whole family. Please bring the kids. We got iPads for them to play on. It's amazing. So next slide, please, Sawyer. This is a case study. Most compelling one of cause and effect I've ever seen. It's for Subaru. Sam and I have been talking about this for quite some time. Subaru did their first Hispanic marketing starting a couple of years ago. This depicts the amount of Subaru growth nationally from the top 10 markets and then the 7 markets where they were active. The funny thing about this, and Jim, this gets back to your point, how do you market to Hispanics, bicultural, acculturated or non-acculturated? It's funny. These guys couldn't have put less thought or effort into it. They had English language spots that they just voiced over in Spanish, so the mouth was out of sync. Most of the scenery was the Pacific Northwest as opposed to like Texas, California, Florida, where Hispanics live, or the desert or the mountain regions. And, so it really, and all they did was basically buy ads. They didn't do any sponsorships. They didn't do any community outreach. They just put an ad schedule with mediocre creative on the air. And still, admittedly, Subaru is a very hot brand. But as you can see, nationally, 13.4% of Subaru's growth was attributed to Hispanics. In the top 10 markets, 68% of their sales come from there, but 12% of their growth came out of the top 10 Hispanic markets. In the markets they were active, which are not, there's only 2 top 10 markets in that group of 7. We're talking about like San Diego, San Antonio, Sacramento, not huge, Albuquerque, Denver, not these monolithic Hispanic markets. 24.7% of their sales is what is represented by these 7 markets. In those markets, 1/3 of all incremental Subarus sold were sold to Hispanics, dwarfing the control group. So really an amazing story of if you build it, they will come. It's really a question of saying, hey, we're glad you're here. We want you to stay. Thanks for doing it. Next slide, please. Let's just keep going. I actually want to touch on a little bit about content and we can wrap it up. NBCU capabilities, we're great. I assure you, we're fantastic. This shows where we where our footprint is. a lot of TV stations, a lot of digital subnets. We're everywhere you want to be. It's just a great story for us. Our competitors have an equally robust footprint. Like I said earlier, you've got a million options. It's just make sure your content's on target. If we can move along. One thing I did want to touch on, we talk about scale. Over the top, which is, your Roku devices, your Fire Sticks, your gaming consoles, they present a new advanced advertising platform where you can target zip code level. So if you're a mom and pop store, fishing and tackle equipment store, we can just target the 2-mile radius around your store, whatever you define as your business zone, or we can help you deliver the whole country if you're Bass Pro Shops or Cabela's. And our competitors all have similar capabilities. So it's a great time to want to reach out to folks and tell them, hey, we're glad you're here. We want you to stick with us. In fact, there's so much more you could be doing. Next slide, please. Okay, we're fantastic. I think I've covered that enough. Next one, please. So another important thing is attribution. No matter who you do business with, they should be able to provide you with some form of attribution. If you're out there spending your precious marketing dollars to try to ask people to stay with you, then you better have a partner who's willing to have their feet held to the fire and say, yeah, okay, it's working. Or say, hey, guess what? I'm not working for you. I'm not the right partner. You should use your precious resources elsewhere to achieve your goals. So we and most of our competition will have some ability to provide you with a dashboard that tells you how well your marketing dollars are working for you. Ours is a company called TV Squared. There are a bunch of them. Ours is pretty effective. But again, it's such a Darwinian ecosystem. If you're not good at what you do, you don't survive very long. So, it's just, I just call it out so that you know that it's out there. You don't have to just take it on faith. You can actually see whether your campaigns are working, whether or not people who are existing customers are going back to your website or existing participants are going to your website and saying, yeah, I want to learn more. I love it. I've enjoyed my first 6 months. How do I get more involved? Next slide, please. Content creation. We talked about content partnerships. We're great at it. We made Jurassic Park, Fast and Furious, all that stuff. We're great at it. So is our competition. It's a great time to be involved in creating content. We have a division within our organization. I had a bunch of great videos that I wanted to show, but I can't. I can try to have those in what we forward to you guys after. But one of the things that I did want to say about just connecting in Spanish, and Sky Castle can help you. Univision can do this for you. But we can build out campaigns from the ground up for you if you don't have an advertising agency, or if you do have an agency that markets for you, we can work hand in glove with them as partners and help you. But one of the videos I thought was so great, one of the speakers said, I communicate in English, but I connect in Spanish. So, as I said, content drives behavior. If you want to retain your enthusiasts, if you want to make them grow within your organization or your product line or whatever it is you're in the business of, you're going to have the right content, and your partner should be able to help you develop that. Your content should be able to travel. Like I said, multi-platform approach is vital because Hispanics of all flavors are consuming their content when, how, where, and on whichever device they feel like it. And we are in a lot of places. We are specifically and conspicuously not in radio, but our competition has a great footprint in radio, so you can be there as much as you need to. This is the slide I really wanted to get to. Thank you so much, Sawyer. So what your content should cover. Here's our recommendations. Really, really simple. You want to retain people. Tell them, hey, man, that was a great idea. You are a genius for going outside and realizing that there's a beautiful planet out here. It's full of amazing resources that you need to cherish, protect, and harvest. Or there's a beautiful world out here. We can just engage in some fun sports and activities as a family. You want to validate the decision to come outside and take up the sports. You want to validate the people by having Hispanic-looking folks in your content, having Spanish words or Spanish or Hispanic accents in it, having cultural relevance in the content. It's vital. And this is how you're going to gain trust and have people want to stay with you, because you're acknowledging their culture. You're saying, we want your culture to enrich what we're doing. Bring all of you with you to us, and that's what it does. There's a huge knowledge gap in almost everything because Hispanics are so much younger. And depending on where they're from, whether they're U.S. born or from another country, there may be an enormous knowledge gap. So your content should have some element of education in it, especially if you're, somebody who's involved in licensing or somebody who's involved in firearms. you're going to definitely want to have an educational component to that. And you're going to want to make sure you partner with with people who can deliver the right consumer at the right time on the right device and with the right content. And we can do it, but I think I've been pretty fair in saying that our competition can as well. So content and distribution is what's going to drive retention, and what I think is the new retention, acquisition. So anyway, if we can just move along, I think that's probably really everything I wanted to touch on. Just a little recap. Hispanics are the future. We've touched on the media landscape. You see it's robust. I think we've covered it pretty well how important it is to, be in touch with this consumer if you want to keep them. Local and regional efforts are important, but having the ability to get down to zip code or out to the national, it just depends on who you are and what you're trying to do. But you want to partner with people who can do that. And then in terms of best practices from a content creation standpoint, you're going to want to associate with content that's relevant, content that screams for attention, content that connects people. You want to have scale. You want to have the content, your content be with content that's portable and very sticky, and have partnerships with those content generators. So that's it for me, folks. I hope this was worth your time. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of your event. Thanks for sticking with me. It looks like everybody did. I can't believe that. I guess that's because it's a virtual happy hour and there's not real actual happy hour. If there's any questions, I'm going to be in a Zoom chat room. And we can talk about poison if you want. Maybe I'll grab a guitar. Who knows? Actually, I won't. So anyway, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you, John, so much for preparing the slide. We're really excited to just, start the happy hour and chat with you more. I know a lot of the conversations and a lot of the questions, as people are giving you rounds of applause virtually, James posed a question that I think will kick off our conversation for the happy hour. It says, this has been some great info and stats, agreed, but how many states have any R3 efforts that are specifically reaching out to Latinx communities in their efforts? Just curious. I know you're not working with states yet, but you and I have spent a lot of time talking about this. And I know we've talked about the RBFF and Take Me Fishing and Vamos a Pescar. And so as we head into the happy hour, I want to just pose that to people to think about, to connect and think, if you're not reaching out to the Latinx community, how could we do that? And no guitar for the happy hour. And how many states are not offering Hunter Ed in Spanish? Fortunately, IHEA is available, and you'll be able to. David Allen's president, and Alex Bear is also the new COO over there. So we'll be able to ask them that question as well. So John, I just wanted to give you an honest thank you for preparing this presentation. I think this will be the first of many. The elements you shared about retaining an audience of a Hispanic culture, as well as just in general, will be very helpful as we move forward. For people's reference, I think there's some elements in the mentoring session tomorrow with Rob Southwick and Matt Dunphy from the Public Management Institute that we can talk about. And then also the retaining and community session, which will feature Adrian Angula, the Hispanic Outreach Manager from TRCP, as well as other speakers and presenters. So our sessions of educational culture are over, but we do have a happy hour coming your way. Before I do that, I have a couple things I need to announce. As you know, Federal Ammunition has offered to give a backpack away to help people stay engaged. Quality Content also does that, as you noted. 410 people for the whole way through is awesome. But Kevin Walton, if you're out there, we'd love you to message Sawyer Conley, and I'll put his information in the chat. It's sawyer@cas.org. Please reach out to us and send us your mailing address and email address. And then we will have one more winner for the happy hours as well. So check back and in order to join the happy hours. So we tried to do something unique here. We tried to make Zoom rooms, breakout rooms. So we sent you an email this morning saying submit your order. That was to pick the Zoom room we want to go to. John Kenny will have a Zoom room with Marketing with NBC. There will be 3 other Zoom rooms, one on COVID-19 responses, one on general R3, and one on multi-state grant panelists. 7 projects, there's many more, and people can join in and chat there. So as you move forward, you need to join the happy hour by hitting the green link right below us. That'll bring you into the Zoom room. Make sure you have Zoom on your computer. I'm assuming 90% of you don't or do, but if you don't, you'll have to go through that step. And then we will work to put you in those rooms. We might have a couple opening words at the start of that happy hour. So grab your beverage and we'll see you over there. Thank you so much, John. Thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you to all of our presenters. We appreciate it and we'll see you at the happy hour. Thank you.